medieval battlefield ran red with the blood of warriors, their cries echoing through the ages as they fought and died for a prize so valuable it was said to season the very fabric of society. Salt, not for crowns, not for thrones, but for the white crystals that preserved armies, filled treasuries, and determined who would feast and who would starve. In the late 15th century, Italy became the stage of a war unlike any other. A war waged not for glory, nor for faith, but for survival itself. A war where the Pope raised armies, cities burned, and rivers carried the dead, all for salt. This is the story of the bloodiest medieval war fought over salt. Salt, the simplest mineral of the earth, yet the most coveted treasure of the Middle Ages. It preserved meat through long winters, cured fish for distant trade, and kept armies alive on campaign. It was the invisible foundation of survival. Merchants called it white gold. Princes taxed it. Empires rose and fell upon its control. To lose salt was to invite hunger. To control it was to hold dominion over life itself. By the 15th century, in the fractured lands of Italy, salt was not just a commodity, it was power. And when the papacy sought to stretch its grasp by taxing salt in the Duchy of Ferrara, the fragile balance of Italy shattered. What began as a decree of taxation became a clarion call to arms. Pope Sixtus IV, the Duke of Ferrara, and the greatest powers of Italy would march into war, and the Po Valley, rich in salt and grain, would become a charnel ground. Salt, the essence of life, was about to be bought with blood.
Salt. The grain that preserved life in a world where decay was constant, merciless, and swift. In the Middle Ages, a carcass without salt was a feast for flies within days. Fish caught on distant coasts rotted before reaching inland markets, unless steeped in brine. Bread, cheese, even medicines, all owed their survival to salt. To the medieval mind, salt was not seasoning. It was survival. It made armies mobile, allowing them to carry food for weeks. It sustained peasants through winters when fields lay barren. It underpinned the economy of kingdoms. Without salt, there was no storage, no trade, no endurance. It became currency. The Roman salarium, an allowance given to soldiers to buy salt, gave birth to our modern word salary. In markets from Paris to Constantinople, blocks of salt exchanged hands like silver. Entire towns rose upon salt deposits, their wealth measured in crystalline white. Monopolies followed. Venice, mistress of the seas, guarded its salt routes with fleets of galleys. Genoa fought to defend its own. The Papal States turned salt into a sacred revenue stream. Elsewhere, rulers imposed heavy levies. In France, the hated Gabelle salt tax would spark riots and plant seeds of revolution centuries later. In China, dynasties built their fiscal strength on salt revenues. In Poland, the vast Wieliczka mines carved cathedrals underground, supplying Europe with riches drawn from stone. Everywhere, salt was gold disguised as dust. But in Italy of the late 15th century, it was more than taxation, more than monopoly. For there, a simple levy on salt would ignite one of the bloodiest wars of the age, a war that showed just how fragile survival could be when life's most ordinary mineral was withheld. In the year 1482, the spark was struck. At the heart of it stood Pope Sixtus IV, a pontiff remembered not for humility, but for ambition. He was a patron of Renaissance art, the man who built the Sistine Chapel. Yet beneath marble ceilings and frescoes, Sixtus schemed as a ruler, not merely a shepherd of souls. He viewed salt not as sustenance, but as a weapon, a stream of revenue to fund armies, palaces, and the expanding reach of the Papal States. To the north lay the Duchy of Ferrara, ruled by Ercole d'Este. Ferrara was small, but proud. A duchy hemmed in by stronger neighbors, yet hardened by generations of survival. Its lifeblood came from the fertile lands of the Po Valley, where rivers branched like veins, carrying grain, wine, and salt through Italy's heart. When Sixtus IV imposed a heavy salt tax, Ercole I resisted. To him, it was more than an economic burden, it was an affront to sovereignty. Ferrara would not kneel to Rome. But the Pope was not alone. Venice, ever hungry for control of the salt trade, seized the chance to weaken Ferrara. Venetian galleys prowled the Adriatic, their eyes fixed on the river routes of the Po. Aligning with the papacy, Venice turned attacks into a pretext for domination. Across Italy, alliances formed. Florence, Milan, and the Kingdom of Naples sided with Ferrara, wary of Venetian expansion. To them, the Pope's war was not justice, it was a threat to the balance of Italy. What began as a fiscal quarrel soon became a continental struggle. By summer's end, armies were mustering, mercenaries marching, and banners unfurled. Salt, common, white, unremarkable, had set Italy on a path to war. 1482, the drums of war echoed across northern Italy. From the lagoons of Venice, galleys slid into the Adriatic, their sails catching the summer wind, their holds filled with soldiers, weapons, and the intent to blockade the Po. Venetian admirals knew that to choke the river was to strangle Ferrara, for it was through these waters that salt, grain, and lifeblood flowed. On land, mercenary armies. The feared condottieri marched. Veterans hardened by decades of Italian wars, they bore pikes, crossbows, and the steel discipline of men who sold their swords to the highest bidder. Under papal banners, they pushed into the Po Valley. The first blows were struck not in grand battles, but in villages and fields. Salt depots were torched. Granaries looted. Orchards cut down. Chroniclers describe Venetian troops burning the fertile plains so that Ferrara might starve. Peasants fled their homes, seeking refuge within Ferrara's walls. By autumn, the war escalated. At Ficarolo, Venetian forces clashed with Este defenders. At Bondino, river fortresses exchanged fire with cannon, their thunder rolling across the valley. For the first time in centuries, the peasants of Ferrara saw their fields turned into killing grounds. The blockade took its toll. With salt supplies cut off, food could not be preserved. Barrels of meat spoiled in the heat. Fish markets emptied. Bread rations grew thin. The people of Ferrara, once secure, now faced famine. A Florentine envoy recorded grim scenes. I saw children gnawing on roots, mothers with eyes hollow from hunger. It was as though the Pope had declared war not only on Ferrara, but on the stomachs of all Italy. The opening clashes revealed the truth of this conflict. It was not a war of knights upon open fields, but of attrition, a war where hunger was as deadly as the sword, and salt, denied or supplied, became the weapon of greatest power. Ferrara endured, but the price was only beginning to be paid. By 1483, the Salt War had descended into a nightmare. The Pope's armies and Venetian allies no longer fought simply to weaken Ferrara, they fought to break its spirit. The fertile Po Valley, once a land of vineyards, orchards, and salt pans, became a wasteland. Fields were scorched, villages pillaged, and churches desecrated. The brutality was systematic. Venetian mercenaries, hardened and faithless, cut through the countryside with fire and steel. Milanese cavalry countered, striking with sudden raids, burning papal outposts, and leaving behind their own trail of devastation. Civilians were caught between the blades. Chroniclers describe peasants slaughtered for refusing to yield grain, entire families put to the sword to terrorize the survivors. Corpses lined the roads, left unburied as warnings. Hunger deepened the cruelty. With salt depots destroyed, preservation failed. Meat rotted within days. Fish spoiled before reaching market. Disease followed famine, carried by swollen rivers and festering ditches. A letter from a Ferrara chronicler, Giovanni Battista Pigna, recalls, "We feared the sword, but the greater terror was hunger. Mothers abandoned their children to seek bread. Soldiers starved beside the poor, gnawing bones already stripped of flesh." Duke Ercole I d'Este, besieged within his duchy, resorted to desperate measures. Rationing was imposed with iron severity. Barrels of salted fish were locked under guard as though they were jewels. Loaves of bread were distributed in public squares beneath the eyes of soldiers. To steal food became treason. Even within Ferrara's walls, desperation bred unrest. Rumors spread that the Pope's envoys promised mercy if the city submitted. Whispers of surrender clashed with cries of defiance. For Ercole, it was a knife's edge: bend and lose sovereignty, or resist and watch his people die. The war had become savage. No longer a dispute over tax, no longer even a contest of power. It was survival, raw, merciless, and unrelenting. And as the flames spread, Italy itself trembled. While swords clashed in the fields of the Po Valley, another war was unfolding in the palaces and council halls of Italy, a quieter war, but no less deadly. The Salt War was never only about Ferrara. It was about balance. The delicate equilibrium of Italian powers that had held since the Peace of Lodi in 1454. Now, that balance was splintering. In Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici, the man they called Il Magnifico, watched Venetian ambition with unease. If Venice crushed Ferrara, its salt monopoly would stretch from the lagoons to the heartlands. Such dominance threatened Florence's trade, and so Lorenzo sent envoys, gold, and words to steady Ferrara's resolve. In Milan, the Sforza dukes feared papal expansion as much as Venetian greed. Secret messengers carried letters across mountain passes, offering men, money, and promises, though never without conditions. The Kingdom of Naples, distant yet influential, weighed its choices carefully. Naples knew that papal power unchecked could one day reach its southern shores. So its king, Ferrante, played a dangerous game of support, sending aid to Ferrara while keeping his own ambitions cloaked. Every court became a chessboard. Every envoy a piece. Behind silken curtains, men spoke of salt not as seasoning, but as strategy. To hold Ferrara was to hold a key to Italy's arteries of trade. To break it was to tilt the peninsula into new dominion. The Pope himself maneuvered with equal cunning. Sixtus IV, furious at Ferrara's resistance, sought to bind Venice tighter to Rome. He sent emissaries across the Alps to France, hoping to draw foreign kings into the fray. His enemies did the same, whispering in courts from Aragon to Burgundy, sowing intrigue and suspicion. Thus, the Salt War was fought as fiercely in shadows as in sunlight. Alliances bent and snapped. treaties were drafted at night, annulled by dawn. What was promised in Florence might be betrayed in Milan. What was whispered in Naples could echo in Rome within a week. The blood spilled in fields was mirrored by the poison poured in council chambers. Italy was a peninsula at war with itself, not only with blades and fire, but with words, bribes, and treachery. And as diplomats plotted, soldiers bled. The war was far from over. Its deadliest chapter was yet to come. The year was 1483, and the Salt War reached its terrible crescendo. The opening raids and blockades had given way to pitched battles, sieges, and massacres. The fertile plains of the Po, once green with wheat and dotted with salt pans, were now fields of ash and mud soaked in blood. Two names echo through the chronicles, Argenta and Poggio Renatico. At Argenta, Venetian forces and their papal allies advanced with overwhelming numbers, their banners whipping in the autumn wind. Ferrara's defenders, bolstered by Milanese cavalry and Florentine coin, met them with desperate fury. Chronicles describe rivers turned red, swollen with corpses as men drowned beneath the weight of armor. Crossbows cut down ranks in waves, cannon thundered across the marshes, and cavalry charges dissolved in the mire. At Poggio Renatico, the carnage was worse. Mercenaries, unpaid, starving, and savage, fought like wolves. Villages caught in the path of the armies were annihilated. Peasants fled into the forests, only to be hunted down. Entire communities disappeared in fire and steel. The Venetian chronicler Marino Sanudo wrote of the slaughter with chilling brevity. The fields were emptied of men, the rivers carried bodies to the sea, and the stench of death hung over the land. Within Ferrara itself, the suffering deepened. Siege threatened from all sides. The price of bread soared beyond the reach of commoners. Salt, once common on every table, became rarer than silver. Families ground weeds into flour, boiled leather for broth, and buried their dead quietly, without ceremony. Yet Ferrara endured. Duke Ercole d'Este, gaunt but resolute, refused to yield. Chroniclers describe him moving among his people, promising survival, swearing that the duchy would not kneel to Rome or Venice. His leadership, though desperate, gave Ferrara its backbone. But the Pope's Grand Alliance began to fracture. Venice, exhausted by mounting costs, questioned Rome's resolve. Milan and Florence pressed harder, fearing Venetian gains. Naples maneuvered still, weighing peace against profit. The climax of the war revealed its true character, not chivalry, not honor, but exhaustion. Soldiers mutinied for lack of pay. Commanders abandoned fields littered with the dead. The Pope's dream of crushing Ferrara faded into a nightmare of stalemate. By 1484, Italy was bleeding from a wound cut open by salt. And all sides, even the victors, craved an end. By the summer of 1484, Italy could bleed no more. The Salt War had raged for 2 years, leaving the Po Valley scorched, the Duchy of Ferrara battered, and the Pope's treasury drained. Armies that once marched with banners now staggered half-starved through ruined villages. Mercenaries deserted in droves, turning to brigandage across the countryside. The land was dying, and with it, the will to fight. The papacy, once confident of victory, stood on fragile ground. Pope Sixtus IV, who had envisioned Ferrara humbled and papal salt revenues swelling, now faced humiliation. His allies were weary. Venice, though still formidable, had poured rivers of coin into the war with little to show but burned villages and bitter enemies. Florence and Milan, staunch defenders of Ferrara, pressed for peace. Even Naples, cautious and calculating, saw little to gain from endless slaughter. Thus, emissaries began to whisper the word no soldier trusted: peace. The neutral town of Bagnolo, nestled on the borderlands, was chosen as the meeting place. There, under the sweltering heat of August 1484, delegations gathered, stern Venetian envoys in their dark robes, Florentine ambassadors armed with eloquence, Milanese agents balancing pride with pragmatism, and Ferrara's representatives, gaunt but unbroken. The Pope himself did not attend. Sixtus, already sensing the tarnish on his reputation, sent legates in his stead. The absence was symbolic. The Holy Father, who had demanded salt as tribute and unleashed war upon Italy, now withdrew from its resolution. The halls of Bagnolo echoed with bargaining. Every word carried the weight of thousands of dead. Venice, unwilling to abandon the war without gain, demanded territory. The Duchy of Ferrara, though still standing, could not claim outright victory. Its people were starving, its land ravaged, its coffers nearly empty. Ercole d'Este instructed his envoys to fight not for triumph, but for survival. For days, arguments raged. Milan insisted that Ferrara must remain sovereign, a bulwark against Venetian domination. Florence echoed the call, determined to prevent one power from unbalancing Italy. Naples pushed quietly from the shadows, ever seeking to maintain its influence in the south. At last, compromise took shape. Ferrara would survive. Its sovereignty would remain intact. The duchy, against all odds, had resisted both Pope and Venice. But survival came at a price. The Polesine, a fertile stretch of land between the Adige and Po rivers, was ceded to Venice. This was the Venetian prize, control of territory that secured its salt monopoly deeper into the Italian heartland. The treaty was signed on August 7, 1484. Known thereafter as the Peace of Bagnolo, it brought an end to the Salt War. In Ferrara, bells tolled. Survivors poured into the streets, not to celebrate, but to breathe in relief. The war was over. The specter of famine, though still heavy, began to ease as trade routes reopened. Yet the scars would not fade easily. Fields lay untended, villages reduced to ash, families broken by loss. The chronicler Ugo Calafini, writing from Ferrara, lamented, "We gained our liberty, yet buried it beneath the bodies of our people. The land is ours still, but it weeps with blood." For the Pope, the peace was bitter. Sixtus IV had dreamed of a papal victory that would strengthen Rome's dominion. Instead, his reputation lay in ruins. Many saw in him not a spiritual father, but a temporal tyrant, whose greed for salt had drowned Italy in misery. His death in August 1484, mere days after the treaty's signing, was seen by some as divine judgment. For Venice, the war was both triumph and warning. The Polesine was theirs, but the cost had been immense, allies alienated, treasuries drained, and a reputation hardened as ruthless and self-serving. For Ferrara, survival was its victory. Ercole d'Este, scarred but unbroken, was hailed as the duke who had defied both Pope and Republic. Yet his duchy was left diminished, poorer in land, and poorer still in the lives of those who had perished. Historians estimate that tens of thousands perished in the Salt War. Not only soldiers cut down in the fields of Argenta and Poggio Renatico, but civilians starved by blockade, peasants massacred in reprisal, and entire communities erased. The war left a countryside hollowed of men, its villages populated by widows, orphans, and the aged. Survivors remembered not glory, but hunger. Not victory, but absence. A Venetian observer admitted bitterly, "For salt, we bought blood. And with blood, we bought silence." The Peace of Bagnolo did not bring harmony to Italy. It merely paused the storm. The fragile alliance system cracked once more, setting the stage for the great Italian wars that would erupt in 1494, when France and Spain descended upon the peninsula. The Salt War had revealed a truth Italy could not ignore, that power in the late Middle Ages was not built on crowns, nor on piety, but on control of resources. And salt, that most ordinary mineral, proved itself more potent than any jewel or relic. Ferrara endured. Venice expanded. The papacy's prestige sank. And Italy, still bleeding, marched inexorably toward greater calamities. Thus ended the Salt War, with treaties inked in silence, lands exchanged on parchment, and a price measured not in gold, but in graves. When the ink dried on the Peace of Bagnolo, Italy exhaled, but it was not a sigh of peace, only of exhaustion. The Salt War left scars deeper than the charred villages or ruined fields of the Po Valley. Its true legacy unfolded in the years that followed, reshaping politics, economics, and the very balance of power in Europe. For 30 years, Italy had enjoyed a fragile harmony known as the Peace of Lodi. It was a system of balance: Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, and the papacy, each restraining the ambitions of the others, their rivalries bound by mutual fear. But the Salt War shattered that equilibrium. The papacy, weakened by the failure of Sixtus IV's campaign, was no longer feared as a temporal power. The Duke of Ferrara had defied the Pope and lived. To many Italian princes, this was proof that Rome could be resisted. Venice, though victorious on parchment, emerged isolated. The pole sign was theirs, but the cost was alienation. Florence mistrusted them, Milan feared them, Naples resented them. The Republic, once seen as the great stabilizer of Italy, was now the great threat. The Salt War had unmasked Italy's reality, that the peninsula was no family of states, but a collection of predators circling one another, waiting for the weakest to stumble. The war also exposed something more elemental, that salt, the simplest of minerals, was the hidden engine of medieval power. Throughout Europe, rulers had long known this. In France, the hated gabelle, the salt tax, filled royal treasuries but fueled unrest. In the Holy Roman Empire, cities vied for control of salt routes along the Rhine. In Poland, the great salt mines of Wieliczka enriched kings for centuries. And in China, half a world away, the empire's salt monopoly was the backbone of dynastic survival. But in Italy, salt was not merely taxed. It was fought for with armies, burned into villages, and written into treaties. The Salt War demonstrated, with savage clarity, that control of food preservation was control of life itself. It was a lesson remembered well into the modern age. Even centuries later, Napoleon's empire, the British Crown, and colonial powers across the globe would fight wars of taxation and blockade that echoed the medieval struggle for salt. In India, Gandhi would march to the sea to protest Britain's salt monopoly, proof that the mineral which bled Italy in 1484 still carried political fire 500 years later. The Salt War also foreshadowed the greater catastrophe to come, the Italian Wars of 1494 to 1559. When French King Charles VIII marched into Italy a decade later, he found a peninsula fractured and vulnerable. The alliances that might have resisted him had already been weakened by mistrust sown in wars like the Salt War. The campaigns of Argenta and Poggio Renatico were small compared to the battles of Pavia or Ravenna, but they set the stage. They showed foreign powers that Italy was ripe for exploitation, a land rich in wealth but poor in unity. The Salt War, though local in scale, was global in consequence. It was one of the cracks that widened into the great fissure of foreign domination. For the people of Ferrara, the war was not remembered in treaties, but in hunger. Generations later, stories were still told of famine winters, of mothers grinding acorns into flour, of soldiers demanding grain at sword's point. The name Salt War carried bitter irony, for to those who lived it, there was no salt, only the taste of ash and tears. Chroniclers in Ferrara and Venice alike recorded the legacy with words heavy as stone. Giovanni Sabadino degli Orienti wrote that Ferrara's survival was a miracle wrought not by saints, but by the endurance of the people. Venetian merchants, looking back, admitted that the war had yielded territory, but at the cost of their honor. The war carved itself into memory not as a triumph, but as a warning, that the smallest resource, when weaponized, can unleash ruin far greater than any crown or creed. And so, the legacy of the Salt War is twofold. It is a story of Italy, of politics and betrayal, of Pope and Duke, of Republic and Duchy. But it is also a universal story, a reminder that civilization itself rests not on ideals or empires, but on the basics of survival. Salt was not glamorous. It was not noble. Yet it preserved life, fed armies, and built treasuries. When denied, it destroyed. In 1482, it drew Italy into its bloodiest local war. Centuries later, it would still hold power enough to spark rebellion across continents. The Salt War's legacy whispers to us that history is not always shaped by gold, by crowns, or by conquests. Sometimes it is written in minerals pulled from the earth, in the grains of salt that seasoned both survival and slaughter. Salt. The most ordinary of crystals, the dust you scatter across a meal without thought, was once the foundation of empires. It seasoned not only food, but the fate of nations. In the late 15th century, the Salt War drenched the fields of Italy in blood. A pope lost his prestige, Venice gained land but lost trust, and Ferrara, battered but unbroken, clung to survival. Tens of thousands perished, not for glory, nor for crowns, but for the right to preserve bread and meat. The lesson endures. History reminds us that it is not always the treasures we call precious that shape destiny. Sometimes, it is the things we take for granted, the grain, the water, the salt. They have always been the true engines of human struggle. And when denied, they have always driven men to war. Today, salt no longer decides empires. But its story lingers as a warning. That beneath every age of splendor, beneath every banner of faith or power, survival rests upon the simplest of needs. And when those needs are threatened, even the most civilized of societies can descend into savagery. The Salt War of 1482 to 1484 was one such descent. It proved that history is not always written in gold, nor in marble, but in salt, and in blood. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to how the smallest things shape the bloodiest chapters of our past, then join us in uncovering more of history's hidden truths. Like this video to help share forgotten history. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories they don't tell in school. And let us know in the comments, what other wars, fought not for crowns, but for survival, should we bring back from the shadows? Because history is not distant. It is alive in every grain of salt, in every struggle for survival, and in every story waiting to be told.